longer allowed to access the news on social media, and what I'm about to show you is absolutely insane. I knew it was coming, but it's here. This morning I wake up to this message on Instagram from this viral account that has almost 700,000 followers. To be honest, I'm over Watergate, I'm over the 75 hard. I don't want them to share my content if that's all they're going to be sharing anyway, but that's not the point of this video. So I go to their account just to check it out, and what I see next, I don't know. Is there an explanation? I don't, like, what is the reason? Look here. People in Canada can't see this content. In response to Canadian government legislation, news content cannot be viewed in Canada. Please somebody tell me what the reason is, because I cannot understand it. Not to come off as ignorant or anything, but 2020, that little news widget on my Apple phone was deleted. I was sick and tired of every day waking up and seeing that little widget with a negative ass news all day, every day. If we as Canadians cannot access other types of news on social media, where are we getting our news from? This essentially means that the only news that we're going to get is from CP24, CBC. If you are not terrified about this, I don't know what to tell you. And I find it hard to imagine that people even in the States know that this is happening. Anyways, I just want to share that because I knew it was coming. In fact, me and my youngest daughter were talking about it yesterday. I was telling her in the car ride, and then I woke up, and this is the first time I've seen this. So I'm scared.
So for those of you listening on audio, she's actually showing an Instagram account, which is a news organization's Instagram account that she's trying to view in Canada to get real-time information, and it is blocked out. She can't see it. And when she says, I doubt people in the States even know this is going on, you know who knew it was going on? Me. Because I have been tracking this kind of legislation that is causing this across many countries and in the United States right now. So earlier this month, the social media giant Facebook began blocking Canadian news on its social media platforms, which include Instagram, in response to Canada's new Online News Act, which passed in June and is expected to take effect by the end of the year. The law would, in the future, require companies like Meta and Google to pay media outlets for news content they share on their platforms. The news ban was called dangerous this week by wildfire evacuees and reckless by the Office of the Heritage Minister, while wildfires forced tens of thousands from their home in various Canadian territories. In a social post, Heritage Minister Pascal called on Meta to reinstate news sharing on Facebook. News organizations, including CBC, Radio Canada, have also asked Canada's Competition Bureau to investigate Meta's decision to block Canadian news, calling it anti-competitive. We think there's a workable solution, said Paul Deegan, president and CEO of News Media Canada, which represents 570 news publishers across the country. What we're saying to Meta is the regulations aren't drafted yet. Pick up a pen, put down your saber, and let's try to work through this together. So in short, Canada passed a very anti-free speech, very anti-capitalist piece of legislation earlier this year that basically said to social media platforms, if there are news links, articles, resources being shared on your platforms, you have to pay the publishers of those links or you will get in trouble. And so as predicted, as we've been saying for some time with various pieces of legislation like this, what the social media companies are doing is just blocking those kinds of links because they have no need to pay those companies for those kinds of resources. The truth is that many of their users are not clicking that kind of stuff anyways. It actually benefits most of the companies more to have access to the platforms and their users than it goes the other way. And so basically to get ahead of this regulation taking effect, Meta had gone ahead and put all the protocols in place to stop this kind of service. Now that there is a natural disaster, we are seeing the colossal consequences of this very bad legislation that is pushed by failing legacy media, unions, and progressives who intentionally are trying to pass these kinds of pieces of legislation, not just to take more control of the tech sector, but also, I would argue at times, to hinder new media and independent media, because as you see more and more resources coming about that people can opt into, we find that people are getting their news from sources like us versus the New York Times. And guess who doesn't like that? The people who can control the narrative when there are only the top news sites that get to publish information. And so this is backfiring majorly, but instead of reckoning with their own policy failures and bad ideas, they're instead trying to blame Facebook for this being in place and now harming people as they're trying to respond to a natural disaster.
Yeah, I have a couple points on this, but one, I think these Canadian officials are demagoguing. They're using these wildfires to attack Facebook for the predictable response that they made to their meddling legislation. However, they're being very misleading because, yes, news is not available on Facebook, on Instagram, on these social media apps, but every Canadian can still open Safari and go to www.whatevernewswebsite.com. They can still go to Google and search latest wildfire news. Like, they aren't actually blocked from getting access to irrelevant information. They just can't get it into their social media feeds because the Canadian government tried to pull this nanny state nonsense and force Facebook to pay publishers for publishers being allowed to market their products on the platform, which is crazy because, you know, Facebook has actually like really reduced news sharing. And you and I know this. It's hurt us both personally quite a bit in their algorithm. But publishers have always been able to profit off of Facebook sharing it because when content is shared and then you get more views on your articles or your videos, you get more ad revenue from your website or from your YouTube page or whatever. So they always have gotten, it's not like they're just having their work stolen and ripped off. When news gets shared on Facebook, publishers do profit through the click-throughs and going to their website and everything. It's just that, you know, if somebody looks at the headline on Facebook without actually clicking into it, then yeah, Facebook gets some content, but you get brand exposure. Like in Facebook, it's a pretty small slice of what they do. So this idea that they were going to shell out huge sums to these publishers, it just never made any sense, and they have no obligation to do it. And in fact, the legislation even said, like, you must do this or stop having it on your platform. And they were like, all right, deal. And now they're all mad at Facebook. It's like, no, you guys messed this up. And now any inconvenience that Canadians are experiencing, which I think they're exaggerating, but it is, you know, it is messed up that if you're a Canadian, you go on Instagram and you're not allowed to view certain things. That is not how I think any of us want it to be. But the blame for that is not on Instagram. It's not on Facebook. And you and I have both criticized these companies in the past for some of the dumb stuff they've done. But in this case, they are not the problem. It is the Canadian government's meddling tech regulations and the predictable, this always happens. When they try to rewrite or micromanage industries they don't understand, their actions have second order and third order consequences they never predicted. And then they're like, oh, who could have seen this coming? Literally all of us. Literally every tech policy free market person in the world, but not your politicians in Canada, who I think just assumed that the world would bend to their will and the way they thought things should be.
Yeah, this comes down to a fundamental point I've made over and over, which is that I can be very critical of tech companies and social media platforms, but you don't have a right to other people's property. You don't have a right to use Facebook's property to market your links, your website. I've found it extraordinarily beneficial to do so in the past. Now they've changed things. It's not as beneficial to do now. I can complain about that, but I still recognize that that is well within their rights. I'm not entitled to somebody else's company to access it or to utilize it for my own business benefits. But this is more indicative of the book I think that I had to read in college called Who Moved My Cheese, about this phenomenon that often happens in business when revenue streams change, when the market dynamics shift. Instead of figuring out where the income can come from now and redoing their business models, a lot of companies that should die, that deserve to die, they don't want to innovate. They don't want to try to do things differently. And so what they instead try to do is use the government to force their old way of making money to work. And that's what you see these news publishers doing. That's what you see many of these outlets coming together to do. You're right. People can still go to their websites, right? But increasingly they're not. And that's because, one, people don't trust the mainstream media all that much anymore. And two, it's because how people are getting their news, that mechanism has changed. I don't go to one dedicated website every morning to get my news. I don't even go to 5 dedicated websites to get my news. What I do is I go to Twitter and I scroll and I open links that are interesting to me and I see what other people are talking about. And the entire dynamic has shifted. And that actually has opened up a ton of new ways to make money on news and information. It's actually opened up broader audiences for those who are innovative and scrappy and want to take advantage of it, like us, like many other people in new media and independent media. But they don't want to do that. They don't want to work that hard. They're dinosaurs, they're boomers. And so what they want to do is try to force these new ways of doing things to pay them out. And it backfired majorly because they didn't play ball. And now it actually, I would argue, is probably hurting people's ability to get quick real-time information, just because the way people tend to get information is not to go to these websites, right? They probably don't even know a lot of these companies exist. Because I mean, I might open a link on Twitter or Facebook here and there, but I'm not necessarily paying attention to what website published it and then, clocking them as somebody I'm going to go to independently. So they really screwed themselves all over. And I want to play this clip of Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pitching an absolutely hissy fit over it.
And I'm going to make a comment on this. It is so inconceivable that a company like Facebook is choosing to put corporate profits ahead of ensuring that local news organizations can get up-to-date information to Canadians and reach them where Canadians spend a lot of their time, online, on social media, on Facebook. Facebook made billions of dollars in profits over the past years, including off of Canadians. And we recently passed legislation that says, Facebook, if you're going to be sharing news or work done by Canadian journalists or local news, you have to make sure they're compensated for it fairly. Well, instead of making sure that local journalists are fairly paid for keeping Canadians informed on things like wildfires, Facebook is blocking news from its sites.
So, Brad, what I think is really interesting in his whole criticism, right, is that Facebook has made a lot of money and that they are therefore so greedy for not paying it back. But number one, it's any company's job to make money. And if they are making money, it's because they are providing a service of value to people. And secondarily, I want to know why it is always considered greedy or selfish for companies to look out for their bottom line, but it's not considered greedy or selfish for companies that are failing to come in and use the government to hold their competitors hostage.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. This whole thing smacks of the taxi drivers try to ban Uber to me. Like the old way of doing things that was less effective, less efficient. They want to kind of use the government to hold on to their golden goose. But I guess I find the whole thing so dishonest because Canada literally had an example. Something very similar already happened in Australia, where they tried to pass these regulations and Facebook's like, all right, we're going to stop doing news. Canada's, and then I believe Australia actually rolled back the regulations in response to this, but I'm not 100% on that part. But anyway, like Canada had an example. They knew what they were going to do. And I'm sure that they were either publicly or behind the scenes talking to Meta, and Meta told them, this is what we will do if you pass this regulation. I'm sure that wasn't a secret, or if it was like an open secret. It wasn't hard to see coming. And yet now they're going to act like, how dare these companies do this amid this tragedy? Well, maybe you should have thought of that when you were writing this rules. Like, okay, well, they're going to respond by blocking news. Could that be bad in this scenario that could happen, or this scenario? It's like, but your lack of planning does not constitute an emergency on Facebook's part. It's like, you done messed up. Now you're reaping what you sowed. So I find the whole thing, I have no sympathy whatsoever for Justin Trudeau or any of these other meddling Canadian politicians. I just think that they messed this up. And it's just, to me, more evidence of why, like, tech regulations, I'm generally skeptical of regulation, but of all things, to expect lawmakers that are often old and decrepit, like, our friend Joe we were talking about earlier, but are also just generally, not experts and not technologically literate, to expect them to regulate the most complex and ever-evolving and rapidly evolving industries is a recipe for disaster in most cases. So I just think maybe just stop. Like, there wasn't a pressing problem here that needed to be addressed. There was no threat to anyone's health or safety, but you meddled, you messed things up, and now you should learn a lesson from it, but instead they're all just playing the victim.
Right. And I think it's an important reminder that public policies, laws, they always have unintended consequences. And that is why they should be excessively limited. They should not be interfering in much. They should actually be letting the free market work and let it determine what people need and get those resources to them, because it will always be more efficient it'll always come with fewer unintended consequences. And so I don't have any sympathy for these people whatsoever, but it does really irk me when you see people put really asinine things into place. You're absolutely right. They were warned about how this would work out. It has been tried in other places, and there were many experts who have weighed in on how this would all unfold, and yet they still did it because they were actually greedy, because they wanted more power and control. And then when it actually gets people harmed, they want to come in and push the blame on somebody else, point fingers elsewhere. One thing I've loved seeing is the Twitter community notes is having none of it as they try to push the spin. So one of their parliamentary members said, Meta's reckless choice to block news before the act is even enforced is hurting access to vital information on Facebook and Instagram. We are calling on them to reinstate news sharing today for the safety of Canadians facing this emergency. We need more news right now, not less. And she got a community note that says, Meta is following Bill C-18 to the letter of the law. The bill states Meta will negotiate payment or stop the links on their platform. Meta stopped the links. And so watching them pitch these absolute fits is absurd. And I hope that this gets to their people. I mean, I really do, because who you put in power matters. And when you put these complete authoritarians, these busybodies over the market, you're going to have bad things happen to you. It's a recipe for disaster. And I do want to remind people in America, they are trying to pass the same thing here. I've been talking about this a bit. I think we've talked about it on the show before, but just as a quick refresher, there's something floating around right now. It's the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act of 2022. It's Senate Bill 673. It is sponsored by none other than Karen Klobuchar. Just kidding, Amy Klobuchar. But it has a number of co-sponsors on it, and they're bipartisan. It's actually quite concerning. There's a number of other Democrats on it, but in addition to the Democrats, there are several Republicans who are currently co-sponsors on this bill. You have Senator Kennedy, Loomis, Collins, Graham, Cassidy, Thune, Wicker, and Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat, but still disappoints me when he doesn't act right. So this is concerning. They are trying to do the same thing here. This is not about protecting journalism. This actually would hurt independent journalists. This is about protecting the mainstream media, propping up dying legacy brands, and trying to keep control of the narrative. That is the incentive for Republicans and Democrats to do this kind of thing, is they want to be able to control the information you're getting, the narrative you're getting. And it worked a whole lot better for them to do that before you had independent media. What happens when you see something like Canadians' law is that when they remove all these links, the big companies like the New York Times, they still have big websites that are more known to the average person. So they're still going to be in existence. They're still going to get traffic. But independent companies rely on being able to share their links and drive traffic to their websites by posting them on social media companies. And so when these kinds of bills pass and the companies strip all news links, who that actually hurts, who actually goes under, are the independent media people, the independent journalists. And I think that that is actually the intention in this case. You cannot be on this kind of legislation and claim to be a capitalist. There is nothing about that is capitalism. This is just sheer protectionism. I think it actually is a violation of free speech, because you are harming the ability for people to share information and to actually communicate with one another online when you're doing this. The whole thing about it is disastrous, and the fact that we keep seeing it pop up in different countries, including in the US, is concerning and something that people need to be more on top of, because these sorts of things, they fly under the radar, right? The mainstream media isn't telling you about this because they want it. They want to knock out their competitors. They don't know how to actually effectively compete with people who are getting information out via TikTok or Twitter. And so this is what they're going to keep trying. So it failed in Australia. It's failing terribly in Canada right now. It will fail anywhere it is attempted from there on out. So it should be unilaterally condemned.